Very much for this kind introduction. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? And thank you for the invitation to Eurosla. Thank you, Gabriele. It's always a pleasure to be back home. Despite the fact that I left Italy 24 years ago, I very much feel that this is my country. And so I welcome the opportunity to speak to you today. And it's very nice to see some old friends, some of whom actually shaped my intellectual development and my career. So it's really very nice to be here. Let me just tell you a little bit what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to cover quite a lot of ground, but you have a handout, so in case I run out of time, you know what I would have said. The leitmotif of my talk is going to be that SLA should perhaps be treated as one type of bilingualism. And it will become clear that I'm using bilingualism, the term bilingualism, in a broad sense, as anybody who has two languages in their mind, regardless of age of first exposure. So I'm going to tackle this question from the vantage point of research on ultimate attainment, which is what I've done most work in. So research on so-called near-native speakers, so speakers who have reached an exceptionally high level of competence in a second language. And I'm going to put this research, particularly recent research, within the broader picture of bilingualism, pointing out some interesting convergences among different kinds of bilingualism. I'm also going to point out that there are important interactions between linguistic factors, executive function, and input. So we have more specific linguistic factors, but also more general cognitive factors that interact in ways that we don't obviously fully understand. But that's the way we should go. And I'm going to show some research directions, so some projects that I have at the moment, that other people have at the moment. And then finally, I'm going to ask a very provocative question. Does it make sense to have a separate second language acquisition field? And I hope I'll provoke your reactions. I hope it won't be anger. I hope it will be fruitful discussion about what it means to have or not to have a separate SLA field. Let me start by pointing out that in recent research, recent research on second language acquisition has changed in the sense that the traditional point of reference for studying second language development was the monolingual native speaker, right? So many people, including myself, compared second language learners with native speakers of the same language. But in recent research, more and more, what we see is that the points of reference are actually multiplying, and increasingly, second language speakers are compared not only with first language monolingual speakers, but also with other bilinguals. So bilingual first language speakers, child second language speakers, adult native speakers undergoing first language attrition. And I'd like to claim that these comparisons are very, very useful because, among many other things, they help us teasing apart the contribution of different factors. So what is specifically linguistic and what is non-linguistic, and how these variables interact and play a role in second language performance. I said at the beginning that I'm going to focus on ultimate second language attainment. Just a little bit of history. I'm summarizing many years of research in one slide, so inevitably this is superficial. But the early descriptive research actually showed very interesting things if you look back at the early data. So it showed that near native speakers, so these exceptionally able speakers, are more similar to native speakers with respect to structures that involve syntax, so pure grammar, rather than in structures that involve the interaction between syntax and semantic distinctions or aspectual distinctions or discourse and pragmatic distinctions. And you can see this from the early studies by Kopiters, for example, White and Genesi, and then on Montrul and Slabakova, but also Birdsong and others that I didn't put down in the slide. And also, the early studies showed that near-native speakers are more similar to native speakers when they're tested with offline measures. So typically, grammaticality judgment tasks, untimed elicitation procedures, but not online tasks. So there are important differences, even in the early studies, between natives and near-natives with respect to speed of processing, for example. So when under pressure, you start seeing differences. Now, in more recent research, we have formulated what goes under the name of the interface hypothesis, which says that certain language phenomena at the interfaces between syntax and other cognitive systems tend to present residual optionality even at the highest level of competence in a second language. So they are unstable even at that level. The kind of interface that has been studied the most is the syntax-pragmatics interface, and this is what I'm going to show you some examples of. I would like to point out that there is a lot of ongoing research in this, and we should avoid easy generalizations like all interfaces are problematic, because this is clearly not true. So some interfaces are problematic, others are less, others are not at all, and we have to discover why. So if we look at interfaces, the natural question is, what is an interface? And there are different meanings of interface that we might want to consider. One is interfaces as connections among components of the grammar. So we have syntax and morphology, for example, or syntax and phonology, syntax and the lexicon, morphology and the lexicon, and so on. We can descriptively call these interfaces as internal interfaces. But also, you can have interfaces as connections between the grammar and other external aspects of cognition. And this is the particular kind of interface, meaning of interface, that I'm going to focus on. Also, in conceptualizing the concept of interface, we have to remember that both internal and external interfaces involve both knowledge of the structures of these interface components. So you have to know the grammar, you have to know the pragmatic conditions, you have to know the mappings that link syntax and pragmatics. But also, you have to consider the processing routines that involve the integration of information from different domains. So it's not just a knowledge question, but it's also a question of putting the bits together in real-time communication. Now, an area that I've done a lot of work in, and other people have done a lot of work in, is the area of pronominal subjects in near-native speakers of null-subject languages. So if you take near-native speakers of just a random language, Italian, you can see that these near-native speakers tend to overextend overt pronouns, overt subject pronouns, to the scope of null subject pronouns. So they tend to use too many overt pronouns. That's what you see. And this happens both in production and in comprehension. So for example, we see this asymmetric pattern in production. So if you take a sentence like, in answer to the question, perché Giovanna non è venuta? Why didn't Giovanna come? A monolingual native speaker would naturally reply by dropping the pronoun, so with one C. Perché non ha trovato un taxi, for example, because she, Giovanna, we've already introduced her in the question, it's a topical antecedent, couldn't find a taxi. Whereas a near-native speaker would waver between one C and one B, where they use an overt pronoun, perché lei non ha trovato un taxi, without any particular emphasis. So not perché lei, I emphasize the pronoun there to show you what I'm talking about, but it's not pronounced perché lei non ha trovato un taxi. It's just normal neutral intonation. And this is optional because they can produce, then they do produce the null pronoun, but they can also produce the overt pronoun significantly more often than monolinguals. In comprehension, you see a similar phenomenon. So if you take a complex biphrasal structure such as a 2A with a main clause with two plausible antecedents and a subordinate clause with either an overt or a null pronoun, you see the same phenomenon. So, la vecchietta saluta la ragazza quando lei attraversa la strada, or quando attraversa la strada. So that means the old lady greets the girl when she, overt or null, crosses the road. Now, the question is, who is the antecedent for that pronoun in the subordinate clause? And there, you see that the near-native speakers behave absolutely like the natives with respect to the interpretation of the null pronoun. So, quando lei attraversa la strada, both groups immediately go to the old lady, so the subject of the main clause. But with respect to the overt pronoun, so quando lei attraversa la strada, that's where you see differences. And the near-native speakers, more often than the natives, tend to go for the girl as the potential antecedent for that pronoun. So it's an asymmetric pattern because there are no there are no very frequent or even attested errors involving null subjects. So when these near-natives use a null subject, they use it appropriately, but they tend to use the overt subjects inappropriately. Now, this is the kind of offline tasks that we used in some of this research. So a picture verification task where people read a sentence such as the one I've just mentioned, and they see 3 pictures, and they have to choose as many pictures as correspond to the meaning of the sentence. So the old lady is crossing the road, the girl is crossing the road, or another feminine referent is crossing the road. This is what happens in second language acquisition at that high level of competence. Interestingly, this is also what happens in native language attrition of native speakers of Italian. So native language attrition of pronominal subjects. So native speakers of Italian like myself, after a long time in an English-speaking environment, start doing exactly that. They start overproducing overt subjects and misinterpreting overt subjects, exactly like the near-native speakers of Italian. They do this, but they don't do that to the same degree as second language speakers. So this phenomenon is greater in non-native speakers than it is in native speakers under attrition. And I'll come back to this difference in magnitude of the effect. Both groups, however, are significantly different from monolingual Italian speakers. Okay? Now, you may think, and some people thought at that time, that this is a phenomenon that, we've only used offline data, so would people do this in online tasks, in real-time communication? There is recent research that they do, and similar patterns emerge from research on a different language. Now, a non-null subject language, German doesn't have null subjects, but it has a distinction between anaphoric forms, demonstratives, and personal pronouns that is similar to the distinction between overt and null pronouns in Italian. So German has both personal pronouns, er, sie, es, and demonstrative pronouns, der, die, das. And both of these series can be used anaphorically, and the division of labor between these two forms is similar to the division of labor between null and overt pronouns. So subjecthood, topicality play a role. So for example, if you have a sentence like that I won't read in German, the waiter recognizes the detective while the beer gets spilled, he or that demonstrative is obviously very hardworking. If you have a pronoun, it naturally goes to the subject of the main clause. If you have a demonstrative, it naturally goes to the non-subject, so the object in that main clause. It's a similar division of labor. And in these online experiments using visual word eye tracking, My ex-student Francis Wilson tested these preferences. So people saw a scene like that. They didn't have to read the sentences because they heard them on headphones. At the same time, they looked at these scenes, and we could measure what they were looking at and the length of fixations and the patterns of eye movements as they were processing the sentence. So what these... And these experiments were done with native German speakers, advanced second language German speakers, and German speakers under attrition because they were resident in the UK, so attrition from English. And what comes out of these experiments is a very similar pattern to what we've seen for Italian. So in a second language, the dependency of pronouns in German as a second language are easier to acquire. So if you look at the second language, advanced second language preferences for the antecedent of pronouns, they're similar, though not completely identical, as those of native German speakers. But where you see a difference is with respect to demonstratives, okay, not with respect to pronouns. In attrited German, you see exactly the same pattern. So demonstratives are significantly more affected by attrition than pronouns. And so if you look at the preferences of attrited German speakers for the antecedent of demonstratives, they show great variability depending on the length of residence in the UK. So either you get no clear preference for either the subject or the object, or you get a preference for the subject antecedent, so the opposite to what the natives do, the natives who are not under attrition. Now, there is no direct evidence that demonstratives are overgeneralized in Wilson's experiments. However, there is at least one study that I know of by Juvonen. So this is a study of Finnish, Swedish bilinguals, and I gather that both Finnish and Swedish have a similar system to German in the sense that both pronouns and demonstratives can be used anaphorically. And these bilinguals use demonstratives more extensively, significantly more extensively than either Finnish monolinguals or Swedish monolinguals. There is another case of convergence that I'd like to point out to you, and this is convergence with bilingual children. This is research that we've done on bilingual children from birth, and research where we actually compare different phenomena because we were interested in knowing whether there are differences among different kinds of interfaces. So we compared the same syntax, pragmatics, and discourse interface that I mentioned, so the use of pronouns, with two other phenomena. So specificity and genericity of bare nominals, and focus and object pronouns. What I would put within the syntax-semantics interface. And we tested large group of bilingual children, older bilingual children, school-age bilingual children, in two different language combinations. So Italian-Spanish, similar languages, Italian-English, different languages, and also in two different settings for the Italian-English bilinguals, in the UK versus Italy. And we also had, obviously, monolingual adult and child control groups. Now, the results for the subject pronouns are interesting because they show the same effects as for the second language speakers, the attrited speakers, but also no effect of language combination. So both the English Italian children and the Italian-Spanish children accept overt subject pronouns in these contexts of topic continuity. So they accept sentences like Paperino ha detto che lui è caduto, where lui refers to Paperino. And so you would expect that Italian-Spanish children don't do that because they have two languages where they have a division of labor between the two pronouns, but they do that. In contrast, the syntax-semantics interface shows very clear effects of combinations. So only Italian-English children accept, for example, generic bare nominals in Italian. So elefanti non volano, meaning the whole category of elephants, but not the Italian-Spanish bilinguals. Only Italian-English bilinguals accept post-verbal objects in unfocused context. So che cosa ha fatto Paperina a Minnie? ha abbracciato lei instead of l'ha abbracciata with a clitic, which would be the natural answer. The Italian-Spanish bilinguals don't do that. They behave like monolinguals. So very important differences that, in my mind, are related to a crucial differentiation between focus and topic. And this is where, you know, the distinction between different kinds of interfaces should start becoming clearer. So on the one hand, we have focus, which is a relational concept that involves formal semantic interface features internal to grammatical representations. On the other hand, you have a topic, which is a referential concept that requires an interface with factors that are external to the grammar, so contextual factors rather than internal factors. Now, the original explanation that we gave of this phenomenon is a linguistic explanation that involves a kind of bleaching of an interface condition at the level of linguistic representations. So the difference between a near-native grammar and a monolingual grammar would be this. So in the monolingual grammar, you would have a one-to-one mapping between overt pronouns and a feature that we can call plus topic shift. The null pronoun would map onto a feature that says minus topic shift, because remember that null pronouns are used in cases of topic continuity, whereas overt pronouns are used typically when you change the topic. Whereas the near-native grammar, but also the attrited grammar, remember, have a three-way distinction. So the null pronoun still maps onto minus topic shifts. Remember that there is no distinction between bilingual groups and monolingual groups in that respect, but the overt pronoun is ambiguous because it can map both to plus topic shift, but also, as we've seen, with minus topic shift. So there is a richer richer range of possibilities in the bilingual grammar than in the monolingual grammar. So this underspecification account can be a common account for second language acquisition and first language attrition. So in one case, you have residual optionality in second language acquisition. In the other case, you have emerging optionality in the attrited grammar. But in both cases, you have an interface feature that is specified in one language and either remains or becomes underspecified due to the absence of this feature in the other language. And in contrast, you don't have differences that involve syntactic features that distinguish between the grammar of the L1 and the grammar of the L2. Those features don't show optionality. And you have a very clear direction of cross-linguistic effects because it's always the language that has the most restrictive option, English in this case, that affects the other, regardless of whether it's the L1 or the L2, but not vice versa. So you have neutralization of L1 distinctions in attrition, but also you have a neutralization of L2 distinctions in second language acquisition towards the other system, whichever that system is. And you have very clear predictions that you wouldn't find effects in the reverse situation, so no effects of Italian on English, so an effect of English native speakers in Italy, they wouldn't start using null pronouns in their language, and they don't, because that wouldn't be an interface effect, that would be a strongly grammatical effect that would alter the grammar, and would means importing, more restrictions in the grammar than there are. Now, this isn't the whole story, though. I mean, it seems like a nice story, but it's not the whole story. Why? Because the overuse of overt pronouns is also tested in speakers that have two null subject languages. We've already seen the example of children, but there are other sporadic examples. We need more research of this kind on bilingual speakers of two null subject languages, so Italian-Spanish, Italian-Greek, Spanish-Greek, and so on. I should warn you that I'm not going to talk about this today, but we have recent evidence that we shouldn't really treat all null subject languages as if they were the same across the board, because there may be very important differences at the level of pragmatic conditions on pronouns. So we have evidence in a paper that we've just submitted about important differences between Italian and Spanish that regard only the overt pronoun, but not the null pronoun. So it's a word of warning, but I'm going to go on exploring this argument as if I hadn't mentioned this, just for the sake of, clarity. So we have overextension of overt subject pronouns in a bunch of studies involving speakers of 2 null subject languages. We have L1 Spanish, L2 Italian, Greek, Spanish, Greek, Spanish, Spanish and European Portuguese, and the study that I've just mentioned on bilingual children. We don't have the extension of overt pronouns in a couple of cases that I'm aware of. I'd like to know if there are other studies, I'd like to know about them. So L1 Croatian, L3 Italian by Crash, L1 Spanish, L3 Brazilian Portuguese. So the difference here is that the null subject language is the 3rd language rather than the 2nd. I'll come back to this. Why should there be a difference? Now, I'd like to revisit this problem at the syntax-pragmatic interface and say that perhaps it's not just a question of cross-linguistic influence from the most economical language to the least economical language. It might be a case that these structures are complex because they require the integration of a syntactic choice with pragmatic and contextual information. So they require more processing resources than structures that are not sensitive to these conditions. So the problem with near-native speakers, but also with attrited speakers and other bilinguals, may be the fact that they are not consistently efficient in computing these mappings in real-time communication. Now, we know already from research in general psychology and psycholinguistics that there are differences at the processing level depending on what structure you're talking about. So structures that involve accessing and integrating different levels of representation, so syntax and discourse, syntax and lexical semantics, and so on, tend to be more costly in processing terms than accessing only the syntactic level. And there is literature out there. These are just 2 examples. We know from research on monolingual processing of pronouns that there is a difference between null and overt pronouns in monolingual native speakers of Italian, for example. So null pronouns, it has been found, are consistently assigned to the subject, remembering those complex constructions. This is what native speakers do. This is what near-native speakers do. This is what attrited speakers continue to do. But with the overt pronoun, there is more flexibility, there is more variability. So overt pronouns are generally assigned to a known subject, but not always. And this research has shown in native speakers, in monolingual native speakers, more variability. Research by Carminati, for example, or Alonso Ovalle. So there is more flexibility of overt pronouns in unambiguous contexts. I'll skip the examples for the sake of time. You can look them up in your handout. Now, native speakers of German, we go back to German, Kaiser and Cruiswell actually explicitly assume that different anaphoric forms have different constraints. So personal pronouns prefer subject antecedents because they have a syntactic dependency, whereas demonstrative pronouns prefer non-topic antecedent rather than non-subjects because they obey a discourse dependency. So they assume that there are a form-specific multiple constraint approach, as they call it, which might be also applicable to Italian, because we do find, even in Italian, a difference between null subjects and overt subjects. There is corpus evidence that shows that demonstratives can be used by monolingual Germans to refer to topic antecedents, and this is an example that you can look up in the handout in your own time from the Frankfurter Rundschau. So it's a reported interview from the paper. So let's, for a moment, change orientation a bit and assume that perhaps what happens in these cases is the use of a default form. So overt pronouns in Italian, demonstratives in a language like German, may actually function as a default form that, in a sense, bilinguals use to compensate for occasional suboptimal processing, but also monolinguals may use in a more restricted range of circumstances. So in a sense, there is continuity between bilingual and monolingual processing, because bilinguals do something that monolinguals also do, but they do it to a greater extent, they do it over a wider range of contexts. So what I'm saying is that it's not just a question of cross-linguistic influence from a language that has a less restrictive setting, but it's actually something that happens because you are bilingual and not because you have a particular combination of languages. So the question now arises, what's exactly the bilingual processing problem then? And this is just the beginning of the story, right? Is it a lack of knowledge, as I said? Is it limitation of resources? Bilinguals have fewer processing resources to do these computations efficiently. Is it a question of allocation of resources rather than a simple limitation of resources? We know that L2 processing in a second language, is in a sense the weak link, and there is a literature out there that I won't summarize in detail. So Claassen and Felser talk about shallow processing because they assume that the knowledge representations of non-native speakers are different from those of native speakers. Kilburn, a long time ago, showed online integration problems in non-native speakers. A recent paper by Roberts, Hulberg, and Indefray shows, again, problems in online integration in the use of anaphoric dependencies. A recent study by Hopp shows problems at the level of efficient access and integration of information. So the message comes rather loud and clear from many different sources. We still have to address the source of these processing problems. Again, Frances Wilson tried to look at this. So she said, she thought, okay, we want to test native German speakers in an extra processing load. So she had a condition in which these native German speakers, while they were processing these sentences with demonstratives or pronouns and looking at these pictures with the eye tracking, they also had to do a concurrent memory task, okay, so at the same time, and that obviously took processing resources away. So the assumption was that if it's just a question of limitation of processing resources, then if you create a context in which you artificially limit the processing resources that people have, then you would find a convergence between L2 German speakers and attrited speakers, and these native speakers under artificial processing load, because we would expect the two groups to be similar to these native speakers under processing pressure. And this is not what happens. So in her experiments, what comes out is that processing load actually affects dependencies across the board, both pronouns and demonstratives, and so it leads to an inability to form dependencies, both at the syntactic level and the discourse level, and probably prevents the successful integration of information. So it seems to me it's not just a resource capacity problem. What about if it's a resource allocation problem? It's a subtle difference here, because the problem here might be not just the sheer lack of resources, right, but the fact that bilinguals actually direct attention to the wrong referent, okay, and that kind of delays the whole operation of integration of contextual and syntactic factors. So resource allocation, there is a literature out there in cognitive psychology, has been defined as the ability to flexibly direct attentional resources as a function of what you hear, the complexity of the incoming material. The effects of resource misallocation might be that, again, bilinguals direct attention to the wrong reference, and that causes a domino effect. So it prevents the successful integration of information, and that leads to occasional, it leads to the optionality that we've seen. Why? Why would it be? Now, my current hypothesis is that one of the reasons why this happens is due to executive control in bilinguals. So we know from research on executive function in bilinguals that both languages in bilinguals are always active. So I'm speaking English to you, but my Italian, I couldn't switch it off this morning and leave it at the hotel, knowing that I wouldn't need it. I'm actively suppressing it. I'm actively inhibiting it. So bilinguals always have to exercise this executive control to avoid interference from the unwanted language. So this may actually take attentional resources away from other tasks, from linguistic tasks, for example. So let's assume by hypothesis that the anaphoric dependencies and the resources that you need to quickly assess the context and choose the pronominal or the anaphoric form partly draws on the same pool of attentional resources that bilinguals and all bilinguals use to keep the two languages separate. Now, if that was the case, that might explain why bilinguals are not consistent at computing these dependencies. We've seen optionality. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. And we also may, this might be a step in explaining the effect size that we saw right at the beginning and the directionality of influence. So remember that when we compare attrited speakers with near-native speakers, what we see is that they do the same things, but the effect is smaller in the attrited speakers than in the second language speakers. Why? It might be that in second language speakers, what these bilinguals do when they speak the second language, they have to inhibit their L1, which is still dominant because it's the language that they've learned from birth. So that language needs more resources to be inhibited and leaves fewer resources to do these computations online. In attrited speakers, however, they use, the phenomenon is seen is in their L1. So the unwanted language is the less dominant language, the L2, which needs fewer resources to be inhibited. And so there is more capacity to run these computations. And we know, by the way, that other populations have a problem with respect to anaphoric dependencies because they are sensitive to cognitive load. These are populations like aging speakers, schizophrenic patients, autistic children. All these populations exhibit problems, inconsistent problems with respect to pronouns, for example, or anaphoric dependencies. And all of them are more sensitive to cognitive load than typical speakers. Now, the interim conclusion at this point is that cross-linguistic influence that I mentioned as one of the reasons, the first reason we considered for these phenomena, for these convergences, is not the only reason. There may be processing limitations that we're trying to understand, but these two explanations are not mutually exclusive. And I know I've been misunderstood, no doubt because of my lack of clarity, and some people think that now I think it's only processing limitation. Not at all. But processing limitations have to be taken into account. So we need both approaches. We need linguistic analysis that tells us where optionality can be expected, but we need also to understand what happens outside language, because those general processing factors can actually tell us when optionality actually occurs. So it's a combination of the two that can actually give us some insights. Now, another reason why we should look at outside language, and the roundtable yesterday, I found it very interesting because it dealt with input factors, input in interaction, right? Well, input factors are neglected in much second language acquisition research. And what is neglected is that bilingual speakers typically get different input from monolingual. So they get quantitative differences, so less input. They also get qualitative differences, which are potentially more important. So they often get input from other non-native speakers or attrited speakers, okay? So they get input from different sources, which is input qualitatively different from the input that a monolingual speaker growing up in a homogeneous community typically gets. So these input effects are important, and we need to understand them better. So we know, for example, from our study of bilingual children, that there are important differences between the English-Italian bilingual children growing up in the UK and those growing up in Italy. not because they do different things, but because the English-Italian bilinguals in the UK do it more than the English-Italian bilinguals in Italy. So the fact that they grow up in Italy and they get more input in Italian actually matters to determine the magnitude of the effect. But we also need to understand how people process language structures in interaction. And I made a comment yesterday in this direction, because this has consequences over time because, with respect to how accessible these structures are and how entrenched these structures become, both in comprehension and in production. So we know, for example, that people align with each other in interaction. I mentioned this at the round table. So there is an adaptability in monolingual, both monolingual interaction, but also bilingual interactions. So priming refers to the enhanced activation of a structure after hearing it. Alignment is the adaptation to the interlocutor's lexical and structural choices. These phenomena are terribly important because first of all, we know that speakers tend to align more to inappropriate constructions that violate external conditions, such as pragmatics, than to ungrammatical constructions that violate syntactic conditions. So remember, it should ring a bell, right? We were looking at interface, structures that are the interface between grammar and pragmatics, and clearly there is more alignment with respect to those constructions. So these are important factors in real life because bilinguals who use both languages actually alternate between languages and different contexts of use for pronouns, many times potentially in the course of the day. These are important factors in experimental settings. If we do experiments, typically we use sequences of switch trials that alternate sentences using null pronouns and sentences requiring overt pronouns. Why? And I'll give you some examples. So first of all, we need to understand how people prime each other in interaction. So understanding, for example, how people prime overt subjects in interaction is, to me, a key to understanding how this changing propagate in the community. So they start from attrited speakers, individual speakers, they propagate in the community, and that is the first step towards diachronic language change over generations. There are also negative priming effects. So positive priming is the enhancement of a structure that is heard. Negative priming is actually a slower response to a stimulus that had to be ignored before, so that had to be inhibited. And this is a new branch of research that I've just recently embarked in. What negative priming means is that the stronger you have to inhibit something, the stronger you have to ignore something, the more difficult it is to bring it back to focal attention when you have to use it. Okay? There is a huge literature on negative priming in cognitive psychology. We are trying to import these findings in the study of bilingualism. So suppose that you have native speakers of Italian, there are two possible mappings. The pronoun can go to the subject, as we've seen, or the pronoun can go to the non-subject, okay? So that's the two choices. Using one of these mappings involves blocking out the other, because the other is irrelevant, okay? So assume this as background. Now let's have a look at negative priming effects across languages, first of all. So suppose that speakers, Italian-English bilinguals, see an English sentence like, Mary said to Paula that she has to go to her cousin's wedding. In this case, the appropriate mapping in English is, of course, the overt pronoun, it's the only possibility there, goes to the subject, so she refers to Mary, that is by far the preferred interpretation. The mapping that says overt pronoun to non-subject doesn't apply to English, right? So it has to be blocked out. It has to be inhibited. Now, the inhibition of this mapping overt pronoun to non-subject when using English may lead to this temporary inaccessibility of the mapping when switching into Italian. So suppose that the same speaker afterwards processing an Italian sentence such as Paola ha detto a Maria che lei deve andare al matrimonio di suo cugino, which is exactly the equivalent of the English sentence. In this case, the lei, the overt pronoun lei, shouldn't refer to Paola, it refers to Maria, okay? But remember that this speaker has just inhibited that mapping. So the result might be that when they process this Italian sentence, that mapping is temporarily inaccessible. There is a delay in accessing. There may be a mistake in computing that dependency. Within languages, we can also test negative priming effects. So suppose that an Italian speaker sees Daniele non vede Mimmo da quando si è sposato. So Daniele hasn't seen Mimmo since he got married. Now, there is a null pronoun there, quando si è sposato. Now, the null pronoun should go to the subject, okay? We've seen that, that is very clear. The appropriate mapping is null pronoun goes to subject. The alternative assignment is not relevant here. It has to be blocked out, so pronoun to object is not relevant. Now, the inhibition of pronoun to object might lead to the reduced inaccessibility of this mapping when processing the next sentence. So, Maria ha scritto a Gianna quando lei era negli Stati Uniti. In this case, lei goes to Gianna, so the object, not the subject. We've just inhibited that in the previous trial. We have a problem accessing it immediately. So there may be a delay, depending on the timing of the experiment, we might see a problem there, a temporary problem. So all this to say, and I really have to wrap up, what I've tried to convey is the fact that the data are always more challenging than they appear, okay? So linguistic and non-linguistic factors are intertwined, they interact with one another. Linguistic theory is important. It tells us where to look, but it can't completely explain the patterns that we've seen. And there is a tendency in linguistics as well as in theoretical language acquisition research to explain everything or to try to explain everything in syntactic terms. So, however, by syntacticizing everything, we run a serious risk. We run the risk of attributing to syntax what should be explained on the basis of different factors. What should be explained on the basis of non-linguistic factors or on the basis of interactions between linguistic and non-linguistic factors. So I'll come back to the big question, right? What is the place of SLA research? What we know and we see, unfortunately, is that there is a lot of relevant second language acquisition research that is done in other fields. Psycholinguistics, general psychology, neuroscience, medical research, etc., etc. This research is presented at other conferences, not Eurosla, not second language acquisition conferences, gets published in wide spectrum journals, okay, cognition, not journals that are specifically on one topic, and is ignored by second language acquisition researchers. Conversely, a lot of good second language acquisition research is not known at all to people working in these other fields. It gets presented only at SLA conferences. It's published only in SLA journals. It doesn't get known by anybody else. And it's a shame. It's a shame because we've seen that we need to understand the interactions of many factors. We bring our expertise, other people bring their expertise, they should communicate, they should know about each other's existence. So what we need, in my opinion, is this. We need more work on syntactic interfaces. So we've seen that the areas, the interfaces between syntax and other cognitive domains tend to be present problems of various kinds, and we need to understand the differences among different kinds of interfaces better than we do at the moment. But we also need more open cross-disciplinary interfaces between linguistics and other fields, between second language acquisition and other fields. And we need much stronger methodological interfaces. So we need to continue to use the methods privileged in linguistic research, and grammaticality judgments is one. I've done research on grammaticality judgments. This is a very nice, I'm very attached to grammaticality judgments, but they simply don't work when you research some phenomena. And we need to understand methods typically used in other experimental fields better and import them and try to cross-fertilize interdisciplinary research. So if second language acquisition is one type of bilingualism, as I tried to suggest, it belongs to a broader enterprise, and it requires a big tent approach. It requires going beyond our little specializations where we feel very secure because we know what we're talking about, we are familiar with the background and so on. We need to go out, we need to understand what happens in other fields. We need to propose our ideas to researchers in other fields. And that means publishing in many journals, not just in SLA journals. Sorry, I'm on editorial boards of second language journals, and it sounds like I'm not doing my own interest, but I really feel that we have to go out more and we have to communicate with other researchers. So it's time to see the forest for the trees, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Antonella, for this lovely presentation. Really. Now it's time for questions. There will be a microphone going around.
Just a clarification question. What is the duration of negative priming? I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
What's the duration of negative priming? Do you perceive it to be a permanent, to have a permanent effect on bilinguals?
That's a very interesting question. Thanks for raising this point. There is a debate in the literature on negative priming whether it is only a very temporary effect or whether it has potentially longer-term effects. The same applies to priming, okay, so positive priming. So if you do experiments, obviously you control, you can see what happens between one trial and the next trial, the immediately adjacent trial. But the question is whether you can see effects also at later points of the experiment, and yes, you can. So there are experiments that show that effects go beyond the immediately successive trial. That still doesn't mean that there are longer-term effects in terms of learning, but it's definitely a possibility that we have to consider.
First of all, Antonella, thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful talk, and one which raised fewer hackles than I thought it might.
What's that?
One which raised fewer hackles with me than I thought it might. Secondly, I think we shouldn't get too hung up on terminology. Okay, we call something SLA.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Sorry.
Okay.
I think we should not get too hung up on terminology. That's to say, if we call something SLA and bilingualism, multilingualism, that's another issue, of course. That's fine. We just have to understand that we're all doing the same thing. I agree with that. Thirdly, on challenging data, I found myself not entirely agreeing with some of your attributions in relation to native speakers of English. Can I just put one question to you about Mary said to Paula that she has to go to her cousin's wedding. Mm-hmm. It seems to me there are contexts and maybe intonations under which that could be interpreted by a native speaker, for example, in a different way from the way you suggest. Okay. For example, if Mary is the mother, Paula is the daughter, and Paula is resisting, for example, it's perfectly possible to interpret that in another way. But I mean, I think that's a problem for all of these data. They're challenging, as you say.
The interpretations are very context dependent, and there are many factors that yeah. So, but would you agree that the preferred interpretation in that case would be that the pronoun refers to the subject? Yeah, and there are clear-cut cases in English where you really see, even in a language that doesn't have null subjects like English, you see the difference between null pronouns and overt pronouns. So if you take a sentence like, John went to the pub with Paul and bought some beer, coordination. You can drop the pronoun. In fact, you have to drop the pronoun. I mean, this is, as a non-native speaker of English, I've always had a great difficulty with that kind of sentences because I tend to, repeat the pronoun there. But in fact, if you drop the pronoun as you should, the understanding, the interpretation is that the subject, John bought some beer, not Paul. Now try it with the pronoun. John went to the pub with Paul and he bought some beer. At the very least, it's ambiguous. It could be Paul, it could be John, but you see that even in English, you can see this difference between different pronominal forms.
Yes, hello. I have a question. You mentioned, so thank you very much for your very interesting talk. You mentioned multiple points of references, such as using bilingual L2 speakers or L1 adults undergoing attrition. Are you aware of literature in the SLA field using, that would only be valid for English, but things such as new Englishes as a point of reference, new varieties of English, comparing, because in corpus linguistics, there's a lot of literature now comparing learner language and new varieties. Of course, for English, but... I'm aware of the existence of that literature. I'm not very familiar with it. Thank you for raising the issue. There are, there is a lot that we need to, findings that we need to import, from fields like that. So I'm also interested in bidialectalism, for example, okay? So what happens to native speakers of American English, after they've lived in the UK for a long time? What happens to, speakers of Veneto dialect in Italy, and, many of them are bilingual with the standard language. I'm interested in those cases of bilingualism, both from a linguistic point of view and also from a general cognition point of view, because as you probably know, the idea that bilingualism for children enhances executive control and attention abilities, does that depend on the typological closeness between the two languages? We simply don't know, okay? And we are not in a position to answer that question. It could really go both ways. The more similar the languages, the more, you really have to put an effort into keeping them apart, and so, that maybe enhances executive control more. So bidialectalism and the different varieties of English could actually give us some insights. Thank you.
Antonella, thank you. The general message, I have no objection whatsoever. Just something which maybe picks up on the last two questions about the German data which you referred to. I think the situation is much more complicated, as always, but I actually can't quote anything on that, but I'll just give you something as a native speaker. The pronoun and what you called demonstrative, there is certainly an important regional difference. And as I said, I don't know of any studies, but I remember when I was in high school, and also someone who's speaking sort of the more southern variety, this is something which should be familiar to Italians, and in someone who's lived in the north for a long time. In high school, our German teacher would tell us, der steht im Stall und die steht daneben. Der, the demonstrative masculine, is in the stable and she is next to him. Meaning you don't use der and die to refer to people, which means, of course, we did it all the time. And as always, a normative thing, the ohne die pas is exactly what one says. And so in other words, if I use your data, the Italian data, I would put the demonstrative everywhere. I wouldn't use in colloquial the pronoun at all. So this is something you definitely have to take into account.
Absolutely, thank you. We need to control for regional differences, as you said, not just for German, but for Italian as well, that we typically don't, right? Because we have to get, especially if you run experiments outside Italy, but even in Italy, you tend not to control for these factors, and they should be controlled. Thanks.
Hi, Antonella, here. Thank you for a beautiful talk. I am entirely sympathetic to your call for broadening SLA work to sort of interface with other disciplines and other types of studies. I was particularly intrigued by your inhibition account of the general bilingualism effect, in particular because, I mean, the work done on inhibition is typically done on lexical processing, so individual lexical words, rather than looking at potential inhibition effects at the sentence level, let alone discourse. So I would just like to endorse this enterprise to try to make SLA researchers perhaps push the development of looking at things like inhibition at the sentence or the discourse level in processing, because I think that's going to show quite different effects from the lexical processing, where you are presenting people with words in isolation and then probing whether or not you find inhibition effects. I think if you have a sentence context, you're going to see different types of patterns in processing and interaction effects between the languages. So I think that's a very, very important contribution, that you're providing to the fields here.
Thank you. Well, I completely agree that much of the research, even the research in cognitive psychology on bilingualism, tends to consider only lexical factors. I mean, partly because it's easier, right? It's much easier to run experiments on the lexicon. But yeah, I'm trying to collaborate with the York, the Bialystok lab, for example, to persuade them that these effects, could actually be useful for them, because they show a different side of inhibition and a different side of, effects. The broad question is the effects of bilingualism on general cognition and vice versa, right? And now the message seems to be, well, there are advantages in terms of general cognition, of early bilingualism at least, but these advantages that are more specifically linguistic. Well, what does that mean? And the only disadvantage that I read about is in terms of lexical access, right? Because they don't consider anything else. But these anaphoric dependencies, for example, would provide a different angle. It might be very useful, again, to interact and put the findings together.
I'm afraid we have to close the discussion now because we have to keep time. And thank you, Antonella, again for this wonderful talk. Okay, we're having a coffee break right here. And then at 11 o'clock sharp, we're beginning the parallel sessions.